Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 12. The Rastem Outpost. Tiberius paced anxiously in the Rastem outpost hidden in the cellar of a general goods store in the northwest quarter of Aram on the morning of the 14th. It had served them well for several months, since the entrance to the cellar was in the back of the store above them, and the cellar's dirt walls stretched beyond the boundaries of that store, creating a large space to house a good number of Rastem. Wooden columns dominated the room along with empty shelves that they had rearranged into room walls to create a little privacy, as well as a maze to confuse any intruders. As far as he knew, the place remained undiscovered, but it was one of few that they had kept so stable. For months, he and Ulrich exchanged messages in different locations around Aram at specific times of the night. This evening, the Rastem messenger he had sent out never returned. He assumed the worst. The Tepish had run across them periodically and always attacked. Sometimes they would learn of it, but more often, they would only find out when the Rastem or Alewo failed to return. If the Rastem presence in Aram were not so essential to keeping the Tepish from spreading, he and his team would have left along with everyone else when the Tepish took over. For years, the Tepish had been content to act in secret, transmutating humans and gathering them to their fold little by little. The reason for their surge to power took little intelligence to decipher. If they are in control, people will more likely flock to them, and they can transmutate humanity without fear of the Rastem code that commands the death penalty for those who transmutate anyone. Since defeating the Tepish in the early 15th century, no one had believed that they would ever return, and certainly the idea that Rastem champions, such as Vladimir and Korean, would ever adopt the Tepish philosophy was completely foreign. People had accused Zechariah of paranoia, but in the end he turned out to be correct about everything. He was closest to the problem, so it would make sense that he would know, but even then it seemed the Tepish-controlled council managed to keep him in the dark about their intentions. They had killed or removed everyone from the council who would not accept them, and then replaced them with those they could trust. But all this was in the past, and now they were left to deal with the chaos they had allowed to grow. In the early days following the Tepish takeover, the Rastem and Alewo were relatively powerless against the sudden Tepish infusion, as they fanned out across Aram to transmutate the local human populace. Following the building of the Tepish fortress, life had settled for the Fempiror who continued to live in Aram, until the Tepish hierarchy began requiring a weekly quota of one new Fempiror. They publicly executed anyone who refused to comply, which effectively emptied Aram of its residents. It was at this point 4 years ago that the Rastem and Alewo made their first attack on the Tepish fortress. Unfortunately, they grossly underestimated the Tepish strength and took heavy losses before retreating into hiding within Aram. Since then, they maintained a presence in Aram to attempt to subvert the Tepish actions, and after several attacks on isolated Tepish troops and levicarts, the Tepish became considerably more cautious. They kept their forces within the boundaries of the fortress, and when they left, the levicarts blasted out of the fortress at speeds the Rastem and Alewo could not match on foot, and they could not keep a levicart ready for a chase. Over time, news of transmutations from their groups outside of Aram decreased, and it became clear that their presence in Aram kept the Tepish trapped there in a stalemate that neither side was willing to break. Through all the losses both sides had taken over the past few years, Tiberius suspected that the Tepish were just as careful with losing people as the Rastem and Alewo were. As long as the Rastem and Alewo remained, the Tepish could not pursue their mission of vengeance out of town because they feared potential attacks on their fortress. The Tepish easily repelled any attacks they made, but those minor scuffles served to show the Tepish that they could not let their guard down to leave the fortress undefended. In fact, Tiberius suspected that if the Tepish losses were similar to the Rastem and Alewo losses, the idea of the Tepish leaving their fortress in any kind of large group was impossible. Only under the threat of attack and the idea that the Rastem and Alewo remain somewhere in Aram do the Tepish remain trapped. The strength of each side rested in the other side's lack of knowledge of their numbers. but knowing that the Rastem and Alewo were hiding in Aram, had led the Tepish to seek them out, and lately this seeking had been extremely aggressive. The constant threat of Tepish discovery caused both sides to increase the number of people watching for any sign of incursion on their outposts, as well as some outposts moving around town more often. This movement usually occurred during the day under day travel cloaks, which served two purposes. First, it kept the Tepish from attacking them, since they knew the Tepish would not want to risk a day attack and losing their own day travel cloaks. Second, and more importantly, it allowed the Tepish to see them from their fortress and reinforced the Rastem Alewo presence during a time when the Tepish could only watch. In recent days, however, the Levikart departures became more frequent, though they never left in a very large group, nor did they stay out for more than an evening. After checking with Fempiror in towns near Aram, they learned of the town of Kalairum. Some Fempiror who had stayed there for a short time spoke of Levikarts coming and going, and that their drivers always wore the red and black Tepish armor. During their investigation, they had continued observing the convoys and gathering information. They had seen them leave and return with bodies laid out on them on several occasions, which prompted the Alewo to send Beth to the fortress to find out what the Tepish were doing. This very evening, they had seen Vladimir himself fly out of the fortress, and both Tiberius and Ulrich hoped that whatever intelligence David and Beth gathered would include this visit. He considered the wisdom of sending David and Beth out together. He and Ulrich both recognized the sadness within them. Ulrich noted that Beth was beyond reckless, and while this made her very effective as a fighter, he feared she placed no value on her life. Likewise, David learned his craft well, but always seemed to have a lingering sadness that always worried Tiberius. He knew he could trust David to back him up, but he was never certain to what extent David would protect himself if it came down to the choice. It was clear that the pair needed to reconcile their past, especially since they had been lovers, and both he and Ulrich accepted the possibility that the pair might become romantically involved. In fact, they expected it. They hoped this reconciliation would lead them to be even more effective at their individual responsibilities, since they would have someone to live for. There was a knock at the shelf that ended at Tiberius' area of the cellar. He turned to the dirty white cloth covering the entrance to his room. "Come in." Kaltesh held the cloth to one side as he stepped solemnly inside the room. Tiberius looked at his expression and instinctively knew he was right about the fate of their messenger. "Tiberius, we found him," Kaltesh said. "Where?" Tiberius asked. "He was still at the designated meeting place, but he had been run through," Kaltesh explained. "Whoever did it to him just left him there to lie in his own blood." Kaltesh handed Tiberius a small sheet of paper. "We found this message on him." Tiberius took the note from Kaltesh and looked it over. The assassin had written the message in Phileterusk. "Suki narselad silstif." "Your days are numbered," Tiberius said aloud, translating the message into the common tongue. "Should we take it seriously?" Kaltesh asked. "While the threat seems empty, we shall take our brother's death seriously," Tiberius said. "Did you make contact with the Alewo?" "Yes, sir," Kaltesh replied. "He was watching over the body. He knew we would come for it." "Of course," Tiberius nodded. "What did he say?" "They've been forced to relocate," Kaltesh explained. "Their outpost was overrun." Tiberius stared at Kaltesh in shock. He put it together in an instant. "Kaltesh, get everyone together," Tiberius said quickly. "Everyone needs their day travel cloaks on, so we can leave as soon as possible." "What is it?" Kaltesh asked. "Who brought this message back?" Tiberius asked quickly. Kaltesh straightened all of a sudden. That was enough for an answer. "I ensured that I was not followed, Tiberius," Kaltesh assured him. "I checked constantly, and did not come back by a straight path. No one followed me, I'm sure of it." "I believe you, Kaltesh," Tiberius said, "but remember that a Tepish soldier is motivated under the threat of his own life. With his mortality hanging over him, I suspect you were tracked by someone as intent on staying with you as you were on shaking him. He didn't want to attack, though. He only wanted to know where you went." "Forgive me, Tiberius," Kaltesh said. "Don't let it concern you, old friend," Tiberius assured him. "We have been too long here anyway. It is time we moved on. I have no doubt that at this moment, though, the Tepish are on their way here. We must leave now. 5 minutes or less. Go." Kaltesh nodded and ran out of the room to prepare the remaining Rastem for a daytime trek across Aram. He knew it was late in the evening, and they might run into Tepish before the sun came up. But if they could get out soon enough, the sun would provide the cover they needed for moving without further Tepish interference. Despite the deadliness of the sun, the Tepish shared this weakness, making it the safest time to move out in the open. The coming day would be their best chance of relocating.